Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending our Iowa History Book Club this month. We are so glad that you are here, virtually, of course. My name is Andrew Klumpp, and I'm the editor of the Annals of Iowa here at the State Historical Society of Iowa. And every quarter, the State Historical Society hosts book club, during which we hear from authors and historians, and we get to discuss all periods and areas of Iowa history. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website. Please remember, though, you have to sign up for each book club meeting that you want to attend. We'll drop a link in, but you can find that on our website. Either way, I'm really glad that you're here, and I hope you'll join us again in the future. One of the things I love about this program is that we get to welcome people from all over the state, from all over the region, even from all over the country with our guest tonight. So it's really wonderful to have you here with us, and we hope you enjoy it today. Today, we're continuing with our 2023 Iowa History Book Club series with A Woman of Adventure, The Life and Times of First Lady Lou Henry Hoover by Annette B. Dunlap. But before we jump in, I want to just touch on a few housekeeping notes. One, closed captioning is available. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. And you can activate that on the action bar. We're all looking forward to a Q&A session at the end of our conversation. Feel free to type those questions into the Q&A feature. That's also going to be on the bottom of the screen. Type those in anytime. If you know you have one already, go ahead and drop it in. I promise we will see it. My colleague Jennifer Cooley and I will receive those, and then we'll be able to pose them to Annette later tonight. So please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions, but we will do our very best to get to them. So feel free to use that. And finally, just want a reminder that by participating in this book club, you agree to engage respectfully with the presenter and the hosts and other participants. Any type of harassing or disruptive behavior, including in the Q&A, is prohibited. So with that said, we are so excited that you're here, and I'm pleased to introduce our guest tonight, Annette B. Dunlap. Annette is an independent scholar and journalist who has worn many hats, as she's told me later tonight. Maybe some of those will come up, but she's the author of several books, including the one that we'll talk about tonight, with some of them being Frank, the story of Frances Folsom Cleveland, America's youngest First Lady, The Gambler's Daughter, A Personal and Social History, and Charles Gates Dawes, A Life. So a wonderful biographer. And we are so excited to have you here, Annette. Thanks for making the time.
Oh, thanks so much for asking me, Andrew. I'm really excited to be with you and have a chance to talk about Lou Henry Hoover.
Yes, I am excited to talk about her too. I was just reviewing the book this afternoon at my desk, and I just was reminded how much I enjoyed the story that you were able to tell about this woman who was kind of in the shadows, if you will, but who really wasn't, right? Like she was living this incredible life.
Right. Yeah. I think she was very much a victim of the era where women were the wives of their husbands and not so much people in their own right. And then there were some things that sort of dinged her memory. First is she was succeeded as First Lady by Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, for activist first ladies, is sort of considered by most Americans and a lot of historians as the gold standard, in much the same way that Jacqueline Kennedy has somewhat become the gold standard for patronizing the arts and for fashion as First Lady. So that certainly immediately cast Lou in the shadows. And then, as you and I were discussing right before we started the program, Herbert Hoover put a decision to have Lou's papers sealed until 25 years after his death. And he did not die until October 1964. So Lou had died in January of 1944. So you're talking anywhere from 40 to 45 years of absolutely no opportunities to study Lou at all, whereas Bert, who I'll refer to Herbert Hoover as through the rest of our evening together, Bert had plenty of time to rehabilitate his own reputation, and Lou did not. So she really did get lost in a lot of events.
Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that because she was a woman, a lot of the ways that she kept records or kept notes, these kinds of things, would have been in those personal papers and less well documented in public life, especially because she was reticent to speak to the public in a way that even for her husband, people could start reassessing his presidency
Right.
almost immediately because so much of his stuff was public record. But with her archive closed, that's where the good stuff was.
Yeah, exactly. She was a tremendous, tremendous correspondent, and that is really where you get to read about her personality. That's how you find out who she is. I noted that when we were kind of discussing some of the things we would talk about, one of the things that you asked me, thought would be worth discussing is what was her personality like, or what did I find out about her that surprised me? But what surprised me is this incredibly vibrant, loving, engaged woman who was extremely philanthropic and who truly loved to be around people and was very, very outgoing. And that warmth comes through in so many of her letters. And of course, the public never saw that because she hated the press. And so she did not, unlike Eleanor Roosevelt, and even who was Lou's successor, and to some extent, Grace Coolidge, who was her predecessor, Lou refused to cultivate relationships with the press. They ultimately tried to correct that, and but she didn't care. Her antipathy for them because of the way they had presented things that Bert had done in the past. It was more about their reporting of him than their reporting of anything she had done, but she didn't trust them. And that also went a long way to hurting her. So you're right. A lot of who she is was locked up in those papers.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned what surprised you, and that was one of the things that surprised me as well, was just how vibrant she was, right? You think of, in some ways, the Hoovers are, for like you mentioned, coming during the Depression and followed by the Roosevelts, are not viewed as this kind of vibrant and active couple. And in some ways they really were, but you really captured that dynamism of her in the book, and I'm glad. And nice to know that it surprised you too, but you also did a great job of capturing that, I felt like.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. Well, I think I could have been a very lazy author and spent a lot of time just quoting her directly, more than I already did. But I really wanted to write a story in a way that allowed her to speak for herself in as many opportunities as was possible and was appropriate for reading,
Mm-hmm.
because you still have to have a story and you have to connect all those dots.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit then, like you found this vibrant, dynamic, trailblazing woman. Could you tell us a little bit about what sparked your interest in her and the topic? I think you mentioned something like that in the introduction or the acknowledgement section of your book, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how you found Lou and then dove in even more.
Well, in retrospect, I'm not sure if I found Lou or if ultimately Lou found me. I certainly hope she's pleased with the way I have portrayed her. Um, what got my interest in Lou started, what goes back really to 2009. And my book on Frances Folsom Cleveland had been published. It was my first book. And I had opportunities to be at the National First Ladies Library in Canton, Ohio. And through a series of circumstances, namely called One's Flight is Delayed, I'm sure people can sympathize with that. I was on the same flight as the archivist for the First Ladies Library, and she and I ended up sitting together in the waiting area at the airport for the additional 3 to 4 hours before our plane finally arrived and we could depart. We were in DC together for an event at the Library of Congress, but hadn't come together. But then we started speaking in the airport. As we got to know one another and become friends, Michelle Gullion, who is their archivist, said, you really ought to consider Lou Henry Hoover, because I had expressed an interest in working on another biography of a First Lady and wanting to do something on a First Lady who really wasn't getting a lot of attention. And that's when Michelle brought Lou up. Well, I remember doing work on Herbert Hoover for a 5th grade report. And now we're going to say, even back in 09, 5th grade was a long time ago. But I knew enough to know that he was not anybody's favorite president. And it was really easy to know he was not everybody's favorite president because of how hard it was to find books about him to do my report on. And we weren't allowed to use just encyclopedias. So I just asked Michelle, why should I even be interested in Lou? And Michelle's response was, Lou, and I'm kind of quoting Michelle here, said to me, I think she is a very underrated first lady. So, '09, there still isn't a lot of information out on Lou. There's not a lot of on the internet, but I kicked it around and kicked it around. I was working on another project at the time, but the whole thing about Lou just would not let go of me. And so finally I contacted the Hoover Library. I learned that there were some opportunities for some assistance with research. I was actually turned down the first year I asked. So I thought, okay, well, this means I am not supposed to write about her. But the next year, it was like, I can't let go of this. And so I applied the second time and I was given the research assistance. And then once I got into her archive and started reading her letters, I mean, that was it. I was sold, and really head over heels. My husband laughed because I used to talk about Frances Cleveland so much when I was writing her biography. And then I'd come home from research and I'd be gushing about Lou. My husband said, I think you love Lou more now than you loved Frances. And I said, yeah, I think I've gotten there.
I'm very familiar with that kind of research moment. There was a woman, not a first lady, in my own research that I fell in love with and would just tell everyone about as I ran into her. Like, you have to meet this woman. But it's a good sign. I feel like that's one of my favorite parts about being a researcher, is when you kind of fall in love with someone and then get so excited you want to tell everyone about this person that you feel like you've just met, right?
Exactly. And now you're saying, I've just met this person, and in our case, it's a she, and she is wonderful. And I want you to meet her too. I want you to see how wonderful she is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I wonder, so that's a kind of a segue to one of the questions I wanted to ask, which was, what's it like to write a biography of someone who was married to such a well-known figure? And so in some ways, you were getting to know this person that other people had known or maybe had misperceptions of. Did you have challenges, or were there advantages of that? Like, wonder if you could just talk about that idea of meeting this person who was kind of in the shadow of this other person that everybody has an opinion on one way or another, whether it's informed or not.
Right, right. Well, part of the problem is that as I got to know Lou's husband, Herbert Hoover, more, the less I liked him and the less comfortable he made me. And so one of the challenges I had in writing the book was, how much do I allow these feelings, these negative feelings that I have developed for Herbert Hoover, get into this book? And of course, since it's nonfiction, and it's important to have documentation. If I'm going to suggest that he wasn't the ideal husband, that he held her back, that he was jealous of her, which are things that I inferred from the material I was working on, how do I substantiate this so that it doesn't come across to a reader as a knee-jerk reaction? And I remember contacting Michelle and talking with her about it, bouncing the ideas off of her. And she was very encouraging and gave me some thoughts on how to handle it. But what also really helped was to find another biography of Herbert Hoover, written by a man by the name of John White. And some of the things that I had picked up on from my research, I found that John White had also addressed those from the Herbert Hoover side of the equation. And when I saw how John White had addressed them, I felt validated in the conclusions that I had drawn, and I was a lot more comfortable in introducing these thoughts into the material that I put in. So what it really came down to was this, developing some negative feelings about Herbert Hoover really helped to push me more in give people compelling reasons to like Lou Henry Hoover and understand why her story has so much value and why she should be, better better recognized for all of the many contributions that she made, because in her own way, she has made a series of lasting contributions that she does not get credit for.
Mm-hmm. And not only contributions, but her brilliance really shines through in the book. I'm struck by the fact that she learned Chinese, right? Chinese is a language I have tried to learn because of some connections I have to Chinese speakers, and it is a hard language, and here she is like learning that in addition to all these others during her time in China. It was fascinating to think about, right? Just how brilliant she was.
Yeah.
Not only with her education in geology, but then to learn all these languages and to be a businesswoman, and very, very inspiring.
Yeah. Well, a term that we don't hear used a whole lot today, but she was a true Renaissance woman in the sense that she had multiple interests, and she excelled at all of them.
Yeah.
Very little. I mean, everybody has failures, but her failures weren't so monumental as to be huge setbacks. They were just the failures of that come with normal human life. And of course, one could say that her in the critical side of things, one could potentially even say that her handling of her role as First Lady was a failure, because she really didn't want to take advice or guidance from anyone. She was going to do it her way. She had been, and you have to look at her from her point of view is, I've been excellent at everything else I've done. I can be excellent at being First Lady. And she underestimated the power of the press to create her image in the eyes of the press, instead of realizing she had to manage that image.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. This isn't a question I sent you, but it is interesting for me to think about the role the press plays, because we often don't think about the press quite as much in the earlier periods of U.S. history. A little bit, right? But we think of, this is before 24-hour news cycles and social media, right? We often think about the ways that we've seen the press or exposure to leaders intensified in the last, century. But she was dealing, you do a nice job of highlighting for us that even though the press was different at the time, it was powerful, and it was something to be contended with by her, often not very successfully.
Yeah. Well, that's true, because one of the things that I think is helpful for us to remember, and it's first of all, most major cities. Okay, so let's this is the era before large broadcasts. Okay, radio doesn't get introduced to the United States. If my Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania upbringing told me the truth, then the nation's first radio station was KDKA Pittsburgh, 1921. And curiously enough, Herbert Hoover is Secretary of Commerce at that time in the Harding administration. And Bert sees this as an opportunity to add one more thing to the commerce plate. And that's where what becomes the Federal Communications Commission gets its start, because Herbert is really the son. So Bert is Lou's husband. Bert kind of grabs that opportunity to start setting radio frequencies. And it just so happens that Herbert was fascinated with ham radio and was a ham radio operator and had a license his entire life. But that's an aside. So radio is not really broad spectrum in the country yet. Every major city has multiple newspapers. Most of those multiple newspapers have taken clear partisan views. People knew which papers were going to endorse the Democrats, and people knew which papers were going to endorse the Republicans, and people knew which additional newspapers might represent a third party or a non-party, quote unquote, nonpartisan, aka non-Democrat, non-Republican viewpoint. And so, and people read. And so, yes, the newspapers were very powerful. News was just as powerful then. It's just the medium of delivery was different than what we're accustomed to now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's an important point to kind of tease out, right? And we, as a historian, you're familiar with that, but sometimes it's a different it's important to note. I wonder, so this is Iowa History Book Club, and the Hoovers are interesting in Iowa history in that they're both Iowans have a claim to both of them,
Right.
right? But they're very young when they leave the state, right? And so I wondered, and it's okay if there's not much of a robust answer, but I wondered if you had any sense of how her time in Iowa, Lou's time in Iowa, or maybe her family's time in Iowa, informed or affected her in any way. And maybe the answer is no, right? But I know she spent time in Waterloo on a couple occasions when she was younger. And I just was curious if there was anything there to that Iowa connection.
So the part that's kind of interesting, we were just talking about partisanship, is Iowa at the time was Republican, and it's important for people to understand that the Republican Party in post Lincoln, through Dwight Eisenhower, even through Richard Nixon, is not the Republican Party that we currently have today. So the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. It was a party that was okay with Blacks being able to vote. It was predominantly more agrarian in nature. So although you had the New York Republicans, McKinley being a shining example, that were in cahoots with the bankers. And yes, William Jennings Bryan was the populist from Nebraska, but Republicanism was something that most people in an agricultural setting were pretty comfortable with. So one of the things that you see in Lou's upbringing, even though it was a relatively short time in Iowa, is she wrote this one school paper when she was attending high school, what we would call high school in Whittier, California. And she wrote that she had thought that Democrats were as rare and as odd as jailbirds. She just the idea of a Democrat was unusual to her. And she also stayed in touch with an aunt who lived, her mother's family had settled near Shell Rock. And so she stayed in touch with that aunt throughout her entire life. And one of the things about that aunt was her Aunt Jessie, is her aunt, Lou's getting ready to become First Lady of the United States, and her Aunt Jessie is chewing her out for things that she has neglected to do with the family. So this was a woman who kept Lou humble.
Yeah.
But the other side, and this was a surprise to me, was when Lou took her father and took Alan on a cross-country trip, bringing him back from California to their home in Washington, D.C. This is pre-presidency. She stopped in West Branch, and she met and talked with some of Bert's relatives. And that's where the seed for what is now the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Birthplace and Museum, those seeds were sown. And so it's Lou who really tries to get that idea generated to buy Herbert Hoover's birthplace from a woman who was offering it for sale. The price was considered too high, so they just sort of sat on that idea. But that is, from what I'm able to determine, that was something that Lou laid the groundwork for. And to the best of my understanding, does not really get a lot of attention or credit for what she did. So that is truly in its own way a lasting legacy in the state of Iowa.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that about her. And I think your point about republicanism is interesting, because Iowa was thoroughgoingly Republican until, exclusively in the governor's office, extremely Republican until the Depression, is when the first time that Democrats really began to challenge anything since the Civil War, truly. And so I hadn't made that connection, that she would have spent those formative years in that very Republican political culture. And then I didn't know that about the library either. Mm-hmm. So clearly Iowa meant something to her, at least in her conception, even if it was a point of origin or a possible place, though she loved California, obviously, too.
Right. Well, if you think about it, California ultimately became home, not only because of her teen years being spent in Whittier, which were probably extremely formative in a lot of different sorts of ways. But her experience at Stanford was truly life-changing, and I think informed a lot of the ethos that she carried with her throughout the balance of her life, because the idea behind Stanford was to make practical citizens and to have citizens who are going to give back. Things that we kind of take for granted now, and that many colleges and universities use as selling points for attracting students, but Stanford was at the forefront of that in university education, higher education, at its founding, with first class, 1894. So, and then of course that is where she met Bert, and her parents were still staying there. Her sister stayed there. What's not well known, and part of this is because the financial records for the Hoovers are sealed, it looks like it's probably going to be in perpetuity. But what little I was able to tease out of that is she was gradually becoming a landowner, and owning real estate, and then co-owning it with her sister Jean, and then inheriting portions of her family's land. So yes, her California roots ended up running very deep.
Yeah, I was looking at the house they had built out there, and like a beautiful home, and like it seems to call to her throughout the book is kind of the
Right.
message I get, right, is that California calls to her as a place of
Yes.
home, even no matter where she is truly in the world. She's constantly all over the world. But it's interesting that she made that stop in West Branch and put those roots down, choosing to kind of make that investment in the Hoover Library being here in Iowa as opposed to California.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Is there anything there, like has anyone pulled on those threads at all to kind of ask why, or was it truly just this is where he was born and she had that connection? Do we know any more there? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious too, because either I missed something in the work that I was doing, or, as to use your phrase, the threads haven't really been pulled yet. And I think probably they are worth doing some pulling, particularly to see just exactly how much Lou was involved. But again, I think it comes under that old phrase, timing is everything. And with her passing, and the land had been, the home was finally purchased, the land was purchased. There was an organization that was available to raise money in the late 30s, in the early 40s. But then, of course, you're dealing with the Depression, and then you're dealing with our entry into World War II, and the redirection of resources once we become competence in that war. But bearing in mind we were really supplying England prior to that, but not to the extent that we needed to dedicate resources after we entered the war. And then of course she passes in January 44, which is before the war ends. So where she fits in all of that with all these other things going on is really would take, like you say, some serious teasing out and thread pulling.
Great. Well, we are about halfway. I'm going to ask one more question, but I want to. We have a couple that have come in through the chat. We had a few that came in early with registration. So if you have questions, it's a great time to put those in the Q&A. But I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll turn it to questions from those who have either sent them in or putting them in the chat. But the question I had is, looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that you would change about the book? Anything you would have included? Any new insights that you've developed? We don't stop learning about these subjects that we study after we finish the project, right? So I'm just curious if there's anything you'd add, anything new and exciting.
Well, I don't know if it's particularly exciting, but I just learned some things about her involvement in Whittier, where she spent her teen years. For one, I just learned that the name of the school she attended, which I thought was Whittier High School, was actually Whittier Academy. The next thing that I learned is I knew I knew essentially that she had been a trustee of Whittier College. I knew she had been a trustee of Mills College. And of course, I chronicled some of the things that she implemented at Stanford University. But I didn't understand or realize how long she had been on the Board of Trustees at Whittier, and that what was called the Whittier Promise, which was to create a student body who would I'm paraphrasing and probably doing a poor job of the paraphrase, but the goal was to make graduates of Whittier knowledgeable so that they could function well in a democracy. And that's a paraphrase, but that so fits in well with things that I learned about Lou and things that seriously concerned her about what was happening with the younger generation, not really understanding the importance of government or how our government functioned. And so she tried to be involved with that. And I can see her being a trustee and definitely voting in favor of that. The other thing that was kind of curious, and this is, totally fresh, is she served on the board with Richard Nixon. Because when he returned to Whittier, he was asked to, after he had graduated law school at Duke, he was asked to serve on the board. And so she shared those responsibilities with him until she passed in 44.
Interesting. And I know you're working on a Nixon related project.
Right. Pat Nixon's trips to Peru and Africa.
Interesting. Okay. Well, more soon, but that's great. Yeah, it's always interesting to see how some of these people cross paths at different times in their lives.
Yes.
And in what places they do so. So I want to make sure we have time for the questions that we had submitted. Some of them are still coming in, but one of them was this person said, I was surprised at the time that Lou and Bert spent apart. In a sense, was theirs a marriage of convenience? And I have a follow-up on that, but I'll leave it there because I also it made me think of another question, but we'll start with that one and we'll go from there.
So that's a really interesting question, and thank you for whoever sent that in. One of the things that I didn't really connect all the dots at first was that when I was initially starting on the research, I remember saying the archivists were saying to me, well, where do you want to start? What area of Lou's life do you want to start with? And I said, well, maybe the best place for me to start would be in her correspondence with her husband. And they said to me, well, there really isn't that much correspondence between her and her husband. And that initially raised huge eyebrows. And I thought, what? And of course, you get into their lives and you realize that their exchanges are in telegrams and they're short, and that their mutual friend Edgar Ricard does more of a job of telling Lou what's going on with Bert than Bert does telling Lou what's going on with Bert when they're separated. But on the other hand, no, it was not a marriage of convenience. I think it was a marriage that matured to a point where Lou wanted her independence, and she felt that she had given up enough of her life for what Bert wanted to pursue, and that it was just time for her to pursue the things that were important to her. And I think it was just by mutual agreement. I think the love and the caring were there, but the need to be in one another's presence on an ongoing day-to-day basis just ended up not being a part of their later lives.
I think that's really interesting, because you do get a sense of some attraction and relationship early on, right? But then yes, it does mature. I think that's an interesting way to phrase it. The question I kind of wanted to follow up was I'm thinking of her as a woman in this era, the late 19th, early 20th century, and the options that are available to women. And I just was thinking about her marriage in some ways opens up the door, even though she was frustrated, of course, right, by the ways that she couldn't contribute. But surely a woman geologist would not be traipsing around mines in China or the Australian outback or those kinds of things. And in some ways, she reminded me, a woman that I study, not to make this about my work, was a missionary wife who marries this guy, because she wants to go to China, and they love each other, but there's also that shared, she wants to go and that's her way to go. And
Yeah.
so it makes me wonder if some of the attraction there with Bert had to do with the world that he could offer her, as getting out and doing the things she'd always dreamed of, because she probably wouldn't have been able to do those as a single woman. I don't know if there's a question in there, but that was something I was thinking of, that this question really sparked in me.
I mean, I think that that's a fair observation, and I would add, kind of add to that a couple of things. First of all, if people have read the book, they will know that John C. Banner said he was attempting to find Lou positions, and that he wanted her to direct her to teaching, but it was pretty clear that she did not see herself as an educator. Although what's absolutely fascinating is she always stayed tangentially involved with education in one form or another. But I don't think she saw herself as a classroom educator. And that's the role that Banner was attempting to thrust her into, because there was another woman who had gotten a PhD and who was teaching geology and the sciences, but that was not the life that Lou wanted. So yes, I agree. I think that Bert offered her the open door. And I think that also part of the attraction was she had been raised in Whittier. Whittier had been founded as a Quaker community. Lou doesn't ever write about attending any Quaker meetings, but there is no question that that is the ethic and ethos that is permeating the city, what is developing into the city of Whittier. Of course, Bert was raised in a very strict Society of Friends home, to the point that he pretty much cast aside a lot of the outward practices of it, including routine meeting attendance. But I think that Lou perceived that he was going to have the egalitarian viewpoints that she had come to associate with Society of Friends, and that would fit in with her own sense of independence. And then, of course, as things get more political for Bert, and that's truly, truly a man's world, she is getting more and more pushed into the background, which is a place that she didn't ever foresee being, and doesn't, she handles it, but the underlying resentment shows up if you dig deep enough in her correspondence. She'll express it to people she trusts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting. I just found that an interesting insight about what that relationship offered her, and in some ways that frustration, while also recognizing that he opens the door, opens the gate. Because if she had married a man who didn't want to travel either, she wouldn't have been able to pursue those things.
Exactly.
Another question, this one was submitted ahead of time, was Lou Henry's mother, Florence, a suffragist? And if so, did Florence support other measures of the progressive era? This person has been doing some research on women's suffrage in Monterey County. So
okay.
Another question too was just thinking about the place of suffrage in not maybe Florence, but also Lou's life.
Right.
If you could say a little more there.
Well, so it's curious because Lou obviously had no serious problems with a woman voting, and she actually wrote about how women were, she wrote an essay in high school lamenting the fact that women were not allowed to vote. But at the same time, she was never active in the suffrage movement, a decision that she made that she got criticism from a friend of hers and Bert's. And so she certainly, and then she ended up becoming a member of the League of Women Voters almost as soon as it was created, after women had received the franchise. But no, as Lou herself was not, which would lead me to assume that her mother probably was not as well. So but the information I have on Florence doesn't indicate anything that Florence would have been involved in that. Also, we need to remember Florence was not a well woman. She started to really get sick in the late teens. I'm drawing a blank on her death date right now. It was pre-presidency, but it was when Lou was already in DC, living in DC. So I don't know that Florence really had the energy to be active anyway.
Mhm. It's interesting to think about. Suffrage also happens in this time
Right.
during her lifetime, right? In ways
Exactly.
you would in some ways, for me it was a little surprising that she wasn't more involved because of how much she fought for her place um, in in public, but also in her career, right? But then to not be a part of that, you know, was surprising, but also interesting. It makes her more interesting.
Well, I think I agree with you. And what I would suggest on that is a couple of things to think about. First of all, she couldn't have been active in suffrage while she was still living in London.
Sure.
Then you get the involvement of World War I, and she's got all those activities that she has become engaged in, and the support, financial support she's trying to drum up crisscrossing the Atlantic Ocean for the Commission on the Relief for Belgium. Then Bert becomes an official in first the Wilson administration, then the Harding administration. To some extent, her hands get tied in terms of being that outspoken and that overt, because suffragists, the outspoken ones, the ones who were doing the marching, the ones who were doing the fasting, they were not thought of well by the Society Washington, even if women actually did agree with, even if these society women did agree that women should have the right to vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, when you put it in that context, right, then it begins to make more sense, kind of where she was, what she was doing.
Right.
That's great. So another question, this one came in ahead of time as well. Let me find it here. Was This one's kind of connected to some things you talked about, but it could be interesting to hear you say a little bit more about. Was the sources that you used? Did you find it challenging to find enough sources to really get to understand her? I know you've talked about some of the things you found in correspondence. Were there things that were particular? And this is were there things that were particularly useful as well? So this is what kinds of things did you find it? And then I'll add: was there anything that you wished you had found that, like the kind of things that you were surprised you couldn't find?
Well, I'll answer the second question first, because it's very easy to answer that one. I wish the financial records were open, because I have several questions about some things that Bert was involved in, and also Lou's role in the financial management and in the land management of their marriage, and in her own life with her sister. So that's what I wish had been available. And I guess for those who may not know my full biography, I have a master in business administration, so it might make sense that I would like to see the business records, because it would give me more insight. As far as finding things, yes, it is always challenging to find things about women in history who really have not been able to get enough attention during their lifetimes, and then eventually get quickly forgotten once they're out of the public eye. So a lot of what I had to do was to rely on all of Lou's massive archive, which I barely, to tell the truth, feel like I barely scratched the surface of. Fortunately, the archive includes newspaper clippings from various events that help frame some things. And then the internet makes a lot of historical information available online. So I could get information and material to help put the things I was reading in her correspondence and get those in a larger context.
Mhm. Perfect. I think that answers the question. I'm always interested in sources too, as somebody who's dug. So another question that just came in is, do you know if there are any records about her time living in Waterloo, or how someone would go about trying to figure out or find any of those things? So that kind of Iowa specific period. She would have been very young, so I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah,
But
that she was born in Iowa. They stayed there. I think they stayed there till she was 5. They moved to Corsicana, Texas. They were not there very long. They came back to Waterloo because her sister, who's 9 years younger than she, was also born in Waterloo. Then they leave when Lou is, I want to say, 11 or 12, to go to Kansas, and that's also again short-lived, and then they finally end up in Whittier. So my understanding is it is hard to find things about the Henry, Florence and Charles and anything about Lou in Waterloo records. I remember talking to one of the archivists at the Hoover Library to get a better sense of what Waterloo was like when Lou was born, so that I could get a sense of, what was going on at that time when she came into the world, and that there are uncertainties as to which side of Waterloo she was born on. What was going on in the city at the time. There was one side of the city on one side of the river that was not particularly affluent, and then there was the other side of the river where there's commerce and better maintained homes. And it's believed that Lou was born on the less affluent side, and then when they came back, they moved to the more affluent side, and that's conjecture. So it's definitely anybody who would really like to dig into some census records. And that's the other thing is, census is only done every 10 years. And if they weren't living in Iowa during an odd year, they're not going to be in the Waterloo. They're not going to show up in those records.
Yeah, I imagined when I saw the question, I imagined it would be a challenging thing to sort through, especially because she was so young. But they could be there. You could do that. The census is a good tool, even if it is kind of a broad. You may hit something, you may not.
Yeah, well, land records, deed record books. If Charles bought any land or bought a home, that would help as well.
Yeah. So on a completely different track, this question comes in and asks if you could just say a little bit more about the Girl Scouts and how she contributed to that organization and the legacy she left there.
Right. So thank you for that question. So in my not so humble opinion, I don't know if the Girl Scouts would still be here today. They celebrated their 100th anniversary of the 100th anniversary of their founding in 2012. I don't know if they would still be here today if it hadn't been for Lou Henry Hoover. When Lou got involved, first as a district commissioner and then agreed to serve as vice president, and then ultimately several years as president of the organization, the organization was losing money right, left, and sideways. The financial records were not being well managed. Records on selling handbooks, uniforms, all of which were things that the Girl Scouts paid for the manufacture or the printing of, and then were supposed to get the monies back. And so Lou, with that business acumen, really begins to dig into all of these financial records. And with her friend Abby Ricard, who also apparently had a strong financial orientation, they try to get this organization put back to rights. A lot of money got fed into the Girl Scouts from the residual funds. So the residual funds that were left over after the end of the Commission for Relief of Belgium got all that funding, those funds became part of the American Relief Association, and that was still administered by Edgar Ricard and that board, with Bert kind of in the background, Lou kind of in the background, but knowing and kind of helping to direct where that money was going to go. So the ARA was continuing to donate money to the Scouts to help keep them afloat until finally Edgar contacted Lou and said the ARA board is, pretty much had it. They're going to have to figure out how to be self-sufficient. So the building of the Scout camps, the professionalizing of the leadership, the training of leadership, all of that was done under Lou, and all that got started with her. And I want to say she was involved with what we now know as the Girl Scout cookie drive, but I'm not 100% certain if that can be credited to her or not.
That'd be kind of a fun thing to add to the list, right?
It would, yeah,
the cookies
absolutely.
that we eat, like are coming from her. We've got about 10 minutes left. We do have time. If folks have questions, feel free to drop those in. We have time to try to get to those. I'm going to ask one of my own. We've got one more. I've got one more that's here. that was submitted ahead of time, but I know we'll have time for that one, but if others have them, drop them in. But this is a question from me. I didn't send it ahead of time, but it got me thinking. I just wonder, you know, we think about the lessons of the Hoover presidency and his legacy, right? That's been talked about a lot. And I wonder what we miss or what people do miss when they ignore Lou. So my question is, how do you think telling her story helps to give her a clearer picture of the political, economic, and cultural moment when she was in power? Does that question make sense? I feel like we often focus on Bert and his presidency and his opinions and his actions, right? And I'm curious, what do we miss when we forget that she was there too?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of things that we miss. I'm not going to start with what could be the obvious one. I will get to it, and that's the invitation to Jessie DePriest to come to tea. But let me, if I feel like everything else will get overshadowed if we start with that. So let's wrap with that. One of the things that really, really bothers me, and this is because I'm somebody who, enjoys the arts and appreciates their value in our society, is all of the hard work that she did to document the furnishings in the White House and to return things to period appropriate, to being period appropriate in the different rooms. And that was really started with some congressional funding under in Congress with Grace Coolidge, but Lou takes it to another level, including paying for the photography and the research on the provenance of every single item. And I do mean every item. We're talking candelabra to large pieces of furniture. And then because of the Depression and because of the hostility to the Hoover name, and then some brouhaha with the photographer not holding up to his contract and selling photos he wasn't supposed to sell, her book has never seen the light of day. But my understanding is that the Hoover Library is in the process of enabling that material to see the light of day, and I'm excited when that will finally be made available in a published form. So you have that piece of it, what she was doing in the White House. She was also bringing artists into the White House and having concerts. So she was really strong in the arts. She doesn't get any credit for that at all. The invitation to Jessie DePriest was just incredible bravery. And, to be quite blunt, Lou was prejudiced. She had racial prejudice. It comes through in her letters, but she recognized that Jessie DePriest was the wife of an elected member of Congress, and that Mrs. DePriest deserved the respect of the position, and that she needed to be treated with that respect. But Lou also recognized what was going to happen if she included Mrs. DePriest in a traditional congressional wives' tea, and so she had to arrange this very quiet, small, intimate tea and quietly give Mrs. DePriest the invitation to attend. And Mrs. DePriest used the invitation, took the invitation. She could have turned it down. She did not. So she recognized what that was also going to do to help her and to help African Americans. So that was a lot of bravery and a lot of courage very early in administration that I think ended up costing them in multiple ways. So probably, that's kind of bookends where she is of two things to remember. And the sad thing is Lou never showed that level of courage again. She never had another congressional tea. She didn't do anything that was going to unintentionally or intentionally call attention to who she invited to the White House. So that's lamentable. But she did at least take that step very early in their administration and paid a price for it.
Mm-hmm. It's such an interesting moment because it helps us see how complicated she was, right? She did look down on people of other races, but she also, she wasn't, she was somewhere in this kind of complex middle space where she wasn't maybe a champion for equality, but also she had complex views. She was a complex person with complex views, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And really capture that well. So another question that came in was my impression, or this is a question, my impression was this was really a dual biography. Was that your intent, or was the text about Bert necessary to tell Lou's story? I think that's an interesting, really helpful way to think.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question and a good one. So thank you for whoever sent that in. Unfortunately, and I did my best to really play Bert down, but the questioner has asked it correctly. Yes, you can't tell who Lou is without showing what was going on with Bert. And so to that extent, yes, we had to know what was going on with Bert, because that, if think about it, that's where we see Lou in that more traditional spousal or wifely role of engaging in activities that help support what her husband is doing. Yes, she had her own things, Girl Scouts being a perfect example, but all that work with the CRB, the work with the Belgian lace, the things that she did with the garden during once we got into World War I and Bert was the food administrator. None of all the people that used to come to dinner all the time, being in the White House, none of that would have been done by Lou if Bert hadn't engaged in the activities that he engaged in. And Lou even wrote at one point that she said, if your father had not done, she kind of outlines it. She's writing this to Alan. If your father had not been involved in such and such and such, basically all his political activities, this route of continuing adult education was the route I would have liked to have taken. So yes, her life becomes somewhat, for lack of a better phrase, hemmed in by the decisions that he makes, and what he's doing has got to be part of her story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have found that, with working with authors or, who are writing about women or people who are just attached to major figures, maybe it's a child or something, it's hard to tell one story without the other because they're so intertwined.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, and so I think it's an interesting question and probably a challenge of biographers. Because you also have written about other first ladies or other major figures who are connected to important people. I'm sure you've run into that.
Yeah, you do. And you just, you try to leave out. I mean, for me, it's how much can I leave out and still make the point? I mean, how much can I leave out about the husband and still make the point I want to make? That's kind of the question that's always in the back of my head.
Yeah, so that it can truly be her biography,
right?
It doesn't become his, but at the same time recognizing that he has to be there for her choices to be intelligible.
Yeah, well, I mean, probably the best way to think about it is he's the shadow.
Yeah, he's everywhere
over what's going on.
Yeah. So we've got just enough time for one question, and it's going to be one that I have, which is just, we'd love to hear about what are you working on now? Are you have any projects in the works? What are you up to these days now that this book is out in the world and people are reading it?
Well, so I really honestly promised that this was going to be the last one, but I guess that's it. But apparently I'm not done yet. The project that I was working on when Michelle suggested that I do Lou was a book about Louis Comfort Tiffany and the business of art, because I had started doing some training for art entrepreneurs. And that book didn't meet the one reviewer specifications for my publisher at the time. And so I really was so involved with Lou, I just put that aside. So I have decided to revisit that, but I'm going to change the focus. And the reason I'm going to work on it is it's about stained glass. It's about the Art Deco period. And I'm fascinated by glass. It's a fascinating medium. I love glass. I'm fascinated by stained glass, but we had a lot of stained glass artists. Louis Comfort Tiffany wasn't the only one. And so I'm really going to do more about chronicling that period and why people like Tiffany are still remembered and some of these other artists are not. So it's a kind of combination art book and art business book is what I'm envisioning for it.
Oh, how fun. And with your business background, I am a historian by training. And so anybody who can do the numbers and work with business is always, I'm always interested to hear what they have to say, because I feel like business people can see things that maybe my humanities mind doesn't always catch, right?
Well,
Especially the numbers.
yeah, considering my undergraduate degrees in government, and I always thought I had a humanities mind, sometimes I surprise myself
Yeah.
with the other side.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we are right about at our time. And and with that, I think we'll wrap it up for tonight's book club. I think we can all agree this has been really informative and a wonderful chat. It's kind of like getting to talk about someone that we admire. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and a big thank you to you, Annette, for making the time to join us. I personally always love it when I have a chance to chat with people whose work I admire. And it's just been honored to have you. And thanks for all that you've done, and the time you've spent talking to us tonight. I really appreciate it.
It has just been my absolute pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Andrew.
You're very welcome. And for those of you who are still here, we hope that you'll sign up for our next book club, which is going to take place in November. It promises to be a fascinating conversation too. We'll be talking about the importance of the Midwest with Sarah Agee, who will discuss her book, Woman Suffrage and Citizenship in the Midwest. So if you had questions about suffrage, November is going to be your time. Sarah will talk about that. For more information or to register for future webinars in this series, you can check that out on our website. You can also look into some of our digital programs, such as the Goldie's Kids Club, watch video recordings of our 101 series, or our Iowa Stories series. You can also subscribe to the Annals, which is the journal I edit and is a cutting edge history journal. So with that, I just want to say thanks so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure, and have a great night.